In the hushed expanse of a county courthouse, under the constant hum of fluorescent lights that cast a stark glow upon time-worn wood panels, an undercurrent of tension stirred on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday. At a narrow, unadorned defendant's table sat Malcolm Evans, a 17-year-old whose quiet demeanor belied the fierce determination in his eyes. His wrists, confined by handcuffs that bit into his skin like winter's chill, bore silent testimony to a fate seemingly preordained. Just behind him, his mother gripped the armrests with desperate intensity, her knuckles pale in the dim light, a silent plea against an injustice she could not voice. 3 nights earlier, the mundane ritual of buying a bottle of water at a familiar neighborhood store turned into a maelstrom of misunderstanding. After a long night of studying at the library, Malcolm had stepped inside for a brief respite. Yet, as he crossed the threshold, the air shifted. An off-duty officer, moonlighting as security, watched him with eyes as cold and calculating as a winter's gust. In that fleeting moment, as Malcolm's phone buzzed quietly in his pocket, the atmosphere tensed, a subtle shift in stance, a cautious hand hovering near a holster. Without warning, a curt command shattered the silence, "Hands where I can see them." And before Malcolm could process the threat, he was violently shoved against the glass door. His backpack was wrenched from his shoulder, and his phone clattered to the pavement, its screen splintering on impact. Amid gasps and a startled cry from a nearby bystander, a knee slammed into his back, pinning him to cold concrete. Though Malcolm had offered no resistance, 2 more officers swiftly surrounded him, and in a heartbeat, he was confined within a squad car, his only witnesses reduced to malfunctioning security cameras and silent onlookers fleeing the scene. Now, seated in that austere courtroom, Malcolm's gaze remained fixed ahead, unyielding as the judge's polished bench came into focus. There, behind layers of worn leather and solemn decorum, Judge Whittaker methodically turned the pages of Malcolm's file, his eyes tracing each line as if weighing the worth of the case. A faint, dismissive smirk played on his lips, a gesture that hinted at preconceived conclusions. Meanwhile, the gentle rustle of papers and the measured rap of the gavel punctuated an atmosphere heavy with expectancy. Leaning back in his chair, Judge Whittaker adjusted his glasses with an air of detached authority. 17 years old, resisting arrest, interfering with an officer, you've certainly been busy, Malcolm, he intoned, his tone laced with the casual cruelty of someone who had long reduced lives to mere case files. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as Malcolm sat still, his silence a potent counterpoint to the injustice of it all. At that moment, Teresa Carter, Malcolm's determined public defender, stepped forward. Her eyes, fierce and unwavering despite the constraints of protocol, declared in a measured tone, "Your Honor, my client was wrongfully detained." But Judge Whittaker waved her aside with a flick of his hand, his voice turning icy. "Wrongfully detained? I've seen this pattern before," he sneered, his gaze narrowing as he addressed the boy as though he were merely another number in a ledger. "Tell me, do you suppose this young man was simply wandering about, minding his own business, when an officer decided to toss him aside as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience?" A ripple of sardonic chuckles swept through the room, each laugh a quiet barb at Malcolm's dignity, while his mother's tense posture spoke volumes of unspoken anguish. Before Carter could continue her defense, the judge's tone turned mocking. "Let me guess, good student, bright future, perhaps even that familiar phrase, wrong place, wrong time?" His words fell like heavy, cynical stones into the already oppressive silence. Under the table, Malcolm's fingers curled into fists, each tightening gesture a small act of defiance against a system that had already penned his fate. It was as though the very idea of his potential had been dismissed before he had even been given a chance to speak. With an exasperated sigh, Judge Whittaker slammed his file shut. "Frankly, I have little patience for these cases, a waste of court time and taxpayer money," he declared, his bored eyes flickering briefly to Malcolm before returning to the mundane details on the pages. It was then that Teresa Carter, with quiet determination, slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. "Perhaps you should review this before making any further assumptions, Your Honor," she said softly, her words a whisper of truth amid the clamor of preconception. At first, the judge's dismissive gesture suggested the document was of little consequence. Yet as his eyes moved over the paper, something within him shifted, a subtle twitch in his jaw, a slight straightening of his shoulders, signals that the carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. The document, a testament to Malcolm's academic prowess, detailed a record of straight A's, a roster of advanced placement courses, and the honor of leading his class, all crowned by a full-ride scholarship to a prestigious technological institute. In that moment, the low hum of conversation gave way to a suffocating silence, every person in the courtroom drawn into the gravity of this revelation. Judge Whittaker cleared his throat, his earlier smirk replaced by a conflicted frown. "Is something wrong?" he asked tentatively, as if the new evidence was an unexpected gust that had unsettled his long-held beliefs. For the first time, Malcolm met the judge's gaze, not with anger, but with a calm, steadfast resolve that silently proclaimed, "I am more than the label you've assigned me." The murmurs in the room swelled, a tide of awareness washing over the assembled figures. Tapping the paper against his desk, the judge struggled to reassert his authority. "So, let me get this straight," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Malcolm. "This young man, who supposedly resisted arrest, is also a prodigy." Carter's immediate, unwavering confirmation left no room for doubt. A heavy silence fell, a silence punctuated only by a brief, hollow laugh from the judge that failed to mask the weight of his error. In that charged instant, the courtroom's dynamic shifted perceptibly. Jurors fidgeted in their seats, even the officer who had instigated the arrest, now seated a few rows back, leaned forward with an expression that betrayed discomfort. The typically unflappable court reporter paused mid-sentence, pen suspended as if unwilling to transcribe a moment so profound. Malcolm's mother exhaled shakily, her hands clinging to her skirt in an effort to steady her racing heart. The judge's once dismissive gaze had narrowed into a calculating stare, as if he were desperately seeking a way to reclaim the narrative that was slipping from his grasp. Summoning the last vestiges of his authority, Judge Whittaker leaned forward and folded his hands, his voice now carrying a hint of reluctant curiosity. "Mr. Evans," he said evenly, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" It was an invitation, a small opening, for Malcolm to disrupt the silence that had long cloaked him in presumed guilt. Slowly, with the weight of years of unspoken judgment behind him, Malcolm leaned forward. His voice, when it emerged, was calm yet resonant, carrying the quiet thunder of truth. "Your Honor," he began, eyes steady and unwavering, "if I weren't the top of my class, if I hadn't earned this scholarship, if I were just another kid from my neighborhood, would that make me guilty?" For a long, suspended moment, the courtroom held its collective breath. Judge Whittaker's attempt at a dismissive chuckle faltered, replaced by a shake of his head, a silent admission that his preconceptions had been challenged. "That's not how the law works, son," he murmured, though even his words trembled with the strain of reconciling evidence with bias. Malcolm's measured tone cut through the tension. "No, because it appears you had already decided my fate before I even spoke." His words, simple yet seismic, rippled through the gallery. Even Teresa Carter's eyes shone with a new light, a blend of respect and recognition of the power of truth. Emboldened by the moment, Malcolm pressed on, his voice rising with a mix of defiance and quiet resolve. "You never inquired about what truly happened, about the evidence, the witnesses. You only sought to see if I fit into your preconceived narrative. I have my whole life ahead of me. If these achievements weren't mine, if I wasn't headed to that renowned institute, would I be here today, or already consigned to another statistic?" His words, firm and unyielding, struck the courtroom like a stone-shattering glass, each syllable a challenge to a system built on assumption and prejudice. As the judge's expression wavered between calculation and uncertainty, the weight of Malcolm's testimony settled over everyone present. The room, once punctuated by dismissive chuckles and murmured sidelines, now seemed to pulse with the gravity of a collective reckoning. Judge Whittaker's eyes darted between the document and Malcolm, his internal struggle evident as he fought to reclaim the narrative he had once controlled so effortlessly. At last, after a pause heavy with implication, Judge Whittaker exhaled slowly and returned his gaze to Malcolm's file. "This hearing, this case isn't as straightforward as it once seemed," he murmured, his fingers curling around the edges of the paper as if to reclaim what he feared was slipping away. With one final, measured pause, he pronounced, "The court finds insufficient evidence to proceed with these charges." Then, with a decisive slam of the gavel that echoed through the silent hall, the verdict was sealed, case dismissed. Yet this declaration was more than a legal pronouncement, it was a subtle, resounding victory against a system that too hastily judged a young man not by his character, but by preconceived notions. Malcolm did not erupt in triumphant celebration. Instead, he stood quietly, slowly massaging the stiff impressions left by the cuffs, and turned to meet his mother's gaze. Her eyes shimmered with both relief and the weight of unspoken struggles, and in that silent exchange, a lifetime of hardship and hope was shared without a single word. As they stepped toward the courthouse exit, the atmosphere in the room transformed. Some onlookers lowered their eyes in reluctant acknowledgement of a system's misstep, while others met Malcolm's gaze with a nod of understanding, a silent tribute to the power of one voice challenging an age-old prejudice. Judge Whittaker watched them depart, his jaw set and his eyes haunted by the realization that the roles of judge and judged had been irreversibly blurred. He knew he would return to his routine, dinner, another day in court, but the memory of this moment would linger, a quiet reminder that the next time a young person like Malcolm sat before him, he might pause to reconsider before condemning. This case was never merely about one boy or one courtroom drama, it was about the relentless struggle against a society that too quickly defines a person by assumptions rather than by the truth of their potential. Malcolm's measured defiance shattered a narrative built on prejudice, challenging each silent observer to question a system that decides fate before a word is spoken. If this story stirred even a fragment of thought in you, let it be shared and discussed. For only when we dare to speak and question can we begin to change a world that so often refuses to see beyond its own assumptions.